Emmanuel Levinas, who is one of the most important figures in the branch of philosophy that I feel a particular connection to, a branch of philosophy that emerged in the 20th century out of the work of Edmund Husserl, called phenomenology. And the essence of phenomenology appears in the word itself, in that you basically have phenomena, or things that light themselves up from within, things that appear, things that manifest themselves. And then you have the logos. You have the reason, or the rational structure in which phenomena are manifest. And so phenomenology is that branch of philosophy in which things which appear are investigated through the bases upon which they appear. And it's a very, very wide-ranging, and in a certain very rigorous sense, infinitely open branch of philosophy. Husserl's primary intent in inaugurating phenomenology was to ward off the dangers of rationalism on the one hand, and also a kind of irrationalism on the other, but to give philosophy its due without setting it into prescribed channels, to give whatever philosophy is the attempt to, or the opening for something like an infinite movement or an infinite possibility. Okay, so phenomenology in a nutshell is a correlation. And this comes out of, especially Husserl, the ideas, the correlation of noesis and noema. And the noesis is the act pole of intentionality. Noema is the object pole. The important thing is to recognize that it's the correlation itself that's fundamental. This is what Husserl is going to call intentionality. This is the structure, the essential structure of all experience. Everything that happens to an experiencing subject happens because there's some way of looking or way of apprehending or way of desiring, and then there's something that's desired or seen or comprehended. And all of the complexity and interest of phenomenology comes out of this correlation and thinking about how these things are necessarily related. And the key insight of phenomenology is that the noema, the things that are thought about or desired or investigated, are always infinite. Husserl gets to have it both ways. On the one hand, you're talking about a philosophy of absolute immanence. You don't pose the question, is the chair really there? But you're only asking about the immanence of a kind of chair experience to my own particular subjectivity. But what Husserl finds, which is such a powerful insight, is that even within the sphere of immanence, even if I bracket the idea that the world is actually out there, even within the immanent sphere of my own experience, there is a transcendence. There is something that is not me. And that's the infinite quality of the noema. So even if I desire the ice cream cone sitting in the chair, so I have a particular mode of intentionality, desire, a particular object, the ice cream as desired, as an object of desire. Even within my experience, I can't reduce the ice cream to simply an object of desire. But in principle, I'm always aware of the fact that it can be viewed from other angles. It can be seen in different ways. And so this is something that we tend to forget, right? We get kind of caught up in our particular way of seeing. But still, all we have to do is step back and look for a second, or realize, and we're always in principle able to realize that the things that we think about or experience in various ways can always be experienced otherwise, and can always be experienced in principle in an infinite number of other ways, right? So there's a kind of a breakthrough of infinity within the immanence of the self. And this way of putting it recollects or maybe repeats the insight of Descartes in the third meditation. It's very important for Descartes that even if you retreat to the sphere of the cogito, within that sphere, there's this one idea, this kind of prickly idea that won't rest, which is the idea of the infinite. And it's on the basis of that idea, which Descartes says, could not possibly be my own creation. In a sense, it had to be placed there from outside. And that becomes then the basis, in a sense, for returning to the world, or actually gaining actual knowledge. It all comes back to the idea of infinity. Okay, so that's the framework within which Levinas steps into philosophy. Levinas was a Lithuanian Jew, and he studied, he came to France, and then ended up studying with Husserl and Heidegger, befriended Heidegger in Germany, and was one of the very first thinkers to bring the insights of phenomenology to France. His first book was a book on Husserl's theory of intuition, that appeared in 1930. And even at this point, right at the beginning, Levinas saw that there was something very, very important about this basic framework for doing philosophy, but he also thought that Husserl inevitably reduced the noema to a certain kind of noesis. And in fact, even though the noema is always, in a sense, prior or greater than noesis, in Husserl, the noesis becomes the kind of criterion for developing a science. And so even in this very early work, Levinas is critiquing that and saying, well, there are modes of noesis that don't reduce to a kind of object. Right? Maybe to fall in love isn't necessarily to have a certain mode of relation to an object, but it might be something that's so intrinsically relational that it can't really be broken up into two poles. And this insight or this direction of Levinas is only furthered by his later work. He was interred in a German prisoner of war camp in World War II, and the experience of the Shoah certainly transformed his sense of what philosophy is and what it should be, and what it can become. He also met a very interesting man named Shoshani, this kind of strange, vagabond Talmud scholar. It's kind of a mystery man, who was also a teacher of Elie Wiesel. And through Shoshani, Levinas became convinced that Jewish Talmud was a very, very important source of knowledge. And he studied this very, very carefully, and this then kind of bleeds into his phenomenological writings. So, Levinas publishes a pair of books, Existence and Existence. Existence, the concept, and then existence with a plural, so things that exist. Or from, the French is from existence to things that exist. And then a book, Time and the Other. And these are kind of preparatory sketches in Levinas. And the real book that brings things together is Totality and Infinity, which Levinas publishes in 1961. And this book is, I think, by any account, one of the most important texts, certainly in the phenomenological tradition, but I think also 20th century philosophy. Being in Time, the works of Husserl, Levinas, Totality and Infinity, and maybe Derrida's Grammatology. They're just a couple of these kind of summit works. And in Totality and Infinity, Levinas contrasts two basic ways of doing phenomenology, or doing philosophy in general. And the one is what he's going to characterize as totality, which is the idea that in principle, all experience can be reduced to something like a single plane. That there is something like a sphere of reason to which everything must be ultimately accountable. And in opposition to this, Levinas wants to hold open the idea of a certain relationship to infinity. And by infinity, Levinas means the relationship to the other. And so, in a certain sense, what Levinas does is he reverses the arrow of Husserl in the case where the noema, although at this point then you can no longer call it a noema, is the other who is respected responsibly in ethics. So in a sense, the slogan of Levinas in this work is, ethics is first philosophy. in opposition to Aristotle, for example, for whom theology would be first philosophy, the knowledge of thought thinking itself. Here, first philosophy, the ground of philosophy, would be a certain relationship to the other, in which the other already has priority. So the self, which would be a kind of ground for thinking, is undermined in this way of approaching philosophy as a whole. And Levinas goes on, writes a series of other works, but Totality and Infinity is really his definitive statement. But over a decade later, in the 70s, his second big book appears, which is Otherwise Than Being. And one of the interesting questions in scholarship on Levinas is the relationship between these two books. Because inevitably, people read Otherwise Than Being as in some ways a reflection on and maybe a kind of imminent critique of Totality and Infinity. And that's basically the line that I want to follow here. Between these two books, it's pretty fair to say you can get all of the Levinas. There's a lot of other writings, in particular his writings on the Talmud, but in terms of his strict works in phenomenology, these two books really lay out the field of his work. So what I want to do is work through the consequences that I see of a certain line of development between these two texts. And I put it there on the handout in terms of a kind of thesis. It's really more of a hypothesis. I'm not really going to end the claim, at least not in any detail. But the claim is, I think in some ways, pretty uncontroversial. I think anyone who's worked through Levinas would agree that there's at least something here. That in the development from totality and infinity to Otherwise Than Being, there's a shift in Levinas's interpretation of the relationship between sensibility and the ethical subject. So you've got a relationship basically between these two terms: sensibility, the openness of the human body onto the world, and the ethical subject, the being responsible for another. And I've tried to kind of exemplify what I see as this shift by just pulling out two quotes from the two works. So I just want to read those, go into those a little bit, and then look at what I see as the consequences of this shift. So first, the quote from Totality and Infinity. Levinas writes, "Sensibility, essentially naive, suffices to itself in a world insufficient for thought. The objects of the world, which for thought lie in the void, for sensibility, or for life, spread forth on a horizon which entirely hides that void. The sensibility touches the reverse without wondering about the obverse. This is produced precisely in contentment." And like everything in Levinas, there's a lot there that you have to unpack. Part of the fun of reading Levinas is these kind of lapidary formulations that you pull apart in order to get at what he's saying. But I think the important point there is maybe this weird image of the reverse and the obverse. This is really a term that comes from coins. The reverse is basically tails, and the obverse is heads. And I'm not sure that what Levinas means here, but this is my sense of it, is that he's saying sensibility touches the reverse without wondering about the obverse. The whole point of printing a coin on both sides is you want to make sure that it's authentic. You want to make sure that someone hasn't kind of cut it in half and given you just half a silver piece or something. So you might find that you look at the obverse, it's like, oh yeah, this is a quarter, or it has the head of Athena on it, or something like this. But when you wonder about the reverse, you would turn around, okay, is this a real coin? Oh yeah, it's got the owl of Minerva on the back, so I know. Or it's got the tails, it's FDR and the Fasces or whatever. So you would ask about the reverse in order to kind of check up on the obverse, or the front side. And so the image here is, I think, reality presents itself to us in a certain way, a kind of naive way. And we might tend to ask, well, what's really behind it? What's behind the impressions that I'm getting about things? And this is obviously a way that philosophy usually approaches the world, kind of suspicion. Maybe things are different than they appear to me. Sensibility works kind of the other way around. It directly touches the reverse right? It's plugged into something that couldn't be an illusion. But it plugs into that thing in a way where it doesn't worry about the obverse. So it doesn't worry about, wait, is this real or not? Or what about the manifestation? It's so plugged into what it's experiencing that there's no question of, what is this really? And Levinas is wonderful in that he's one of the only philosophers in the whole tradition to focus on certain phenomena that we usually see as non or maybe counter-philosophical. Things like sleep, fatigue, aging, forgetting. Points at which the human ability to question is itself called into question. I mean, and it's a very interesting fact that people go crazy, for example, if they don't sleep. Well, what does philosophy have to say about this? And in particular when Levinas then calls us, in a certain sense, to be insomniacs. He uses this term. He asks us to, in a sense, never sleep, to be worried to the point where we cannot sleep. And he always means that in a kind of allegorical way, but also in a very literal way. There's always this weird point in Levinas where the absolutely literal and the allegorical or figurative are sort of touch each other, meet up exactly. So here in Totality and Infinity, Levinas is saying, here's sensibility that suffices to itself in a world insufficient for thought. And in the rest of the text, Levinas really develops this idea that the human subject emerges first in what he calls a sphere of enjoyment or contentment. And this is rooted intrinsically in sensibility. And he makes the point, basically, that in all of our experience, we affirm life, we affirm ourselves without even questioning it. Even when we hate life, there still is basically a tendency to move on. And that this is related to our embodiment in some way. And that's why, he says here, sensibility or for life. Because it's very much rooted in the power of the organism to move forward. And Levinas is ultimately concerned with the other and this ethical relationship and ethical responsibility. But in Totality and Infinity, that relationship is secondary. It's first in the sense of first philosophy. It's the most important thing. But in Totality and Infinity, this doesn't happen. The other is not manifest. My responsibility for the other doesn't appear until I've established a kind of relative zone of contentment, of enjoyment. So basically the idea is that you have to form yourself in a kind of self-enclosed realm, and then the other is able to kind of pierce that bubble. So, this is all in a kind of general sense. This isn't necessarily a point in your life, but in terms of different levels of experience, there's a grounding level of self-enclosed contentment, happiness. And it's only once that's been established that something outside of that zone can appear and you realize, oh wait, that's actually the most important thing. I have to give up my self-centeredness in order to respond to the needs of the other. And Levinas develops this especially through a very complicated and interesting notion of paternity, that the self is related to a certain kind of eros and caress of the other, which produces basically the son, produces the progeny. And so there's a very interesting movement into history here. But the point for our purposes here is that sensibility isn't ethics. Sensibility is related to the sphere of contentment. And we need sensibility in order to have ethics. We can't relate to the other without this kind of groundedness in the world. But our basic groundedness in the world comes first. And he even uses the language of an occasion. It's a kind of occasional cause. It's because we're embodied and sensible beings that ethics becomes possible. It kind of supervenes upon a kind of basic mode of sensibility. Well, the worry here for Levinas, he wants, I should write ethics too, he wants ethics and our relationship to the other to be the fundamental priority of philosophy. And the worry in Totality and Infinity is that even though it ends up being the priority, In terms of levels of constitution, it's secondary. And so, in Otherwise Than Being, Levinas sets himself the task of trying to put our relationship to the other, which is a relationship of ethics. It's a relationship of being called to respond to the other in a way that you can't choose. Right? Someone's suffering right there. You can't choose to create a theory of whether they should be helped or not, but you must help them by simply the fact that that person suffers. So Levinas wants to put that at the very center of our being. And so he has to shift his understanding of sensibility. And the quote here from Otherwise Than Being, Levinas writes, "It is because subjectivity is sensibility, an exposure to others, a vulnerability and a responsibility in the proximity of the others, the one for the other, that is, signification. And because matter is the very locus of the for the other, the way that signification signifies before showing itself as a said in the system of synchronism, the linguistic system, that a subject is of flesh and blood, a man that is hungry and eats, entrails in a skin, and thus capable of giving the bread out of his mouth or giving his skin." Notice it's actually just one sentence. And like everything in Levinas understands formal logic, actually. He writes in the footnotes, there's actually a very interesting dialogue with formal logic. And a lot of times, what seems to be gibberish, if you pull out the form of what he's saying, you can get it. Notice the form of what he's saying. He says, "It is because subjectivity is sensibility, and matter is the locus of the for the other, that a subject is of flesh and blood." Now consider that claim. It's a very strange claim. It's because I-hood, subjectivity, is sensibility, is intrinsically this relationship to material sense being. And because matter, right, which doesn't have anything to do with subjectivity a priori, just matter, material stuff, is the very locus of the for the other. That a human being, a subject, is of flesh and blood. So, what Levinas is trying to do here, in the movement from totality and infinity to Otherwise Than Being, is he's trying to put the relation to the other, and the ethically responsible relation to the other, deeper than the level of subjectivity, prior to I-hood, prior to the emergence of a self. So rather than there forming a self first, and then ethics comes on top of it, ethics is actually somehow implicated in material reality itself, such that an ethical subject can be possible. So, if I'm right about that there's a shift there, and I want to emphasize that I don't think it's an absolute shift. That you can certainly find quotes in Totality and Infinity that are already halfway to Otherwise Than Being. But there still is a definite shift of emphasis, and I think ultimately there's a discontinuity. There's a point at which the levels of constitution do flip. And in particular, you can see this with the term that Levinas deals with of maternity. Levinas's philosophy is very gendered, which is very interesting. The subject is a very male subject, and there's a very interesting relation to the feminine other. And in Totality and Infinity, the feminine other is a face. And it's related to domesticity and the home and a kind of dwelling, habitation. But the feminine is a face, a kind of already a person. And Otherwise Than Being, maternity is what Levinas will call material signification. And here, rather than the feminine other being a face that sort of shields the newborn or something like this, the newborn emerges within the womb of the mother. And so maternity is a material relationship prior to a woman basically, if you think of it this way, a mother or a pregnant woman can be intimately related to the being in her uterus prior to even knowledge. She might not know she's pregnant, right? But nonetheless, the very movement of her body is actually feeding, is actually creating, constituting a relationship. And so that's one way I think to see this shift, is in the way maternity shifts from the face of the woman to the sort of the body of the woman. But I think it opens up a very interesting problem, and I think it's a problem that's not only present for Levinas, but is a general philosophical problem. And it's a problem of the relationship of the individuated human subject to materiality. And so I tried to pose this problem through a kind of diagram here. And I definitely want to get to the discussion, so I want to just kind of summarize this quickly and then see what you have to say about it. But the idea is, I think you can make sense of this problem by isolating three terms. You've got the human subject, let's say the ethical subject, the aware subject, who is divided for Levinas between a moi and a soi. It's sort of the ego that enjoys itself, and then the soi, or the self, which is always not quite itself. So there's this kind of self-division already there in the subject, but the subject is basically the conscious, ethically responsible human. And then you have the other, which is it's the other human, but more importantly for Levinas, in terms of phenomenology, it's the other as what is radically non-phenomenal, what can never appear. It's very important for Levinas that you are responsible to the other even before you know what they want or what they need. And that's the very basis of responsibility. You are a responsible being even if you don't know that people are suffering. Even before the Buddha saw old age, sickness, and death, he was already responsible to those who were dying. And so I've got the arrow there. The relationship between the other and the subject in Levinas is clearly something like ethical assignation. The other is sort of pointing at the subject and saying, this is what you have to do. These are my needs. This is how you must respond to me here. Although the me is not phenomenal. It's not a person per se. And then you've got this other arrow from matter to the subject. I think that's just a kind of a simple way of diagramming sensibility. Sensibility is a relation of material reality to the subject. Well, the problem that's posed in Otherwise Than Being is the relationship between the other and matter. And what's interesting about totality and infinity is that problem doesn't really emerge because the levels of constitution work the way they do. So you don't need to figure out how the other and matter are related, because the other is precisely the other of the phenomenal world and the material world. The relationship between matter and the subject is interesting and complicated, but once that's established, the other just kind of comes in as this, in a certain sense, a deus ex machina. The other just is there. There's no accounting for it. But in Otherwise Than Being, you have to account for it somehow, because the other is already somehow in matter. Matter is the very locus of the for the other. So there's some relationship there. And so what I've tried to set up as the problem here is, I think that there are only two ways to do it. And each of these ways, you could nuance them in various ways, but I think there are basically two ways to relate them. And the one would be to put the other as prior. That the ethical other is somehow constitutive of matter. And if that's the case, then you basically have either a logic of creation, and you have a theological claim that the other has, in a sense, created the material world, and thus, otherness is sort of intrinsically there because there's already this creative relation, or maybe something like a relationship of grace or incarnation, but it would necessarily be structured as a kind of theological claim. Or you would move somehow from matter into the other. And this would be some sort of historical relationship, and I think the best way to account for it would be some sort of process of semiosis. This would be the best philosophical account today of evolution, for example, that organisms evolve and develop basically through the use of signs. And the use of signs is a very good way to account for the relationship between a complicated human brain and a relatively uncomplicated nematode or bacterium or something like that. That the movement of signs is able to complexify itself so as to constitute complex relations. But if you go that way, then the other becomes in some sense subject to history, which I don't think Levinas is going to like. So I kind of want to leave it then with maybe a kind of dilemma for Levinas. Do you want theology, or do you want some sort of evolutionary semiosis? Or is there some sort of third?
All right, let's take our course, we should open up a question, but I want the first shot. So I'm particularly concerned since, 13 hours ago, about our moral obligation to animals. And so there's this question, and I'm wondering if it's posed by this problem. I'm trying to get at this problem. Mm-hmm. I don't think I have a moral obligation to worms, but I think I do to dogs. And there's two reasons for this. Maybe there's some kind of theological reason, right? That God made dogs somehow special to humans, right? But there's also this evolutionary reason, right? They're more sophisticated. They're more phylogenetically like us. And I'm just wondering, is this a way to tease out the problem? Why is it that we have intuitively a moral obligation to dogs over worms?
Yeah.
Is this getting at
I think, yeah, no, that's a great, it opens up a whole host of problems, I think, or a whole host of questions. Spinoza has a great answer to this problem, which is that we have more in common, or we have enough in common with the dog. And this is why Spinoza's ethics makes a lot of sense. It all holds together. Why do you care more about dogs than spiders? Because you share certain powers or affects with the dog. You have a relation to the dog. Therefore, you're going to be ethically engaged with that dog. You're sufficiently different from a spider that, in a sense, you don't care. You care to some minimal degree, right, that you haven't crossed some sort of threshold. But that kind of solution won't work at all for Levinas, because he's so committed to the idea that what you are responsible for is absolutely other. What Levinas is so worried about is the host of conditions that made National Socialism possible. And in particular, the ability of human societies to a priori exclude certain groups. It's very important to look into, laws under Hitler. They were very carefully crafted. Of course, they ended up breaking their own laws at various points too, but it was always crafted so that, for the Jew wouldn't be defined as a citizen, right? And so you can always shape things philosophically. If you're carving up reality in one way or another, you can always exclude, in a sense, who you want to exclude. And that's the problem. Is if the other is already contained in under some set of conditions of thought, then it's no longer the other. And this is the idea that Derrida develops out of Levinas, and it's certain almost absurd conclusions that ethics means nothing if it's not an absolute openness. If you're only, it's like, oh, of course I'm going to care about, the suffering person who, seems nice. What about the suffering person who's persecuting me? What about the point at which I'm required to sacrifice myself for someone whom I consider maybe even absolutely evil? And Levinas doesn't give himself any tools for dealing with this problem. Maybe it's unfair to ask that of him, because what he's pushing is the idea that ethics means nothing if it doesn't mean an absolute openness to the needs of the other. But that's where, animality is this really interesting problem, because in a sense the animal seems to be more other than the human, but Levinas wants to constrain it to humanism. And I think it's because, I don't know. I don't know how he can account for that exactly, except that his idea of the other is already construed through a notion of the suffering human being.
Okay, so he would answer this question by saying, oh, you don't have a moral obligation to either the dog, or you have the obligation to neither the dog nor the worm,
yeah.
but just the human.
Yeah.
Correct.
This, looking at the relationship between the other and the subject, makes me think of a theory in psychology that talks about self in relation, that the individual never exists independently. It's the Wellesley v. Stokes. But one of the things there's two things actually that strike me about it. One is that the Wellesley people talk about the other as being constantly present, but not as imposing ethical obligations. And the second is that the effects are not unidirectional. They move in both directions. Why has Levinas chosen to say that they impose moral and not just social obligation? And why is it unidirectional? I mean, don't we, for the other, serve as an ethical obligation, according to Levinas, or is that other necessarily other non-human?
Well, that's in a sense the whole problem is it's very, very difficult to even keep in view what Levinas is saying. And I think that this happens all the time, that there's a kind of reception problem in that there are a lot of people out there who like the sound of the word ethics because it sounds like being nice. Oh, yeah, of course I want to be a nice person, so here's someone who's writing about ethics. They say ethics is the most important part of philosophy. Oh yeah, well, I mean, maybe Levinas is basically saying the most important thing is being a nice person. But it's very, very far from that. And in fact, he's saying something so radical that if people took it seriously, it would completely undermine our received notion of ethical responsibility, because we presume a kind of responsibility. It's very hard for us to even make sense of the claim, this person is totally oppressing me to the point of death, and the most important thing for me to do is to be responsible for their actions somehow, to the point of self-sacrifice. I mean, most of us would see that in some sense as a very non-ethical action, that there would be points of necessary resistance. And Levinas does open the door for this he has the idea of the third, that this relationship as absolutely other is only between you and someone who's suffering or someone who's persecuting you. But it's a one-to-one relation. But then there is this interesting figure of the third, the neighbor, or the next but one. And especially he gets this from the Jewish theologian Franz Rosenzweig. And this changes things. Because as soon as I'm responsible not just for you, but for you and the person next to you, suddenly reason enters in. I have to start calculating. And so Levinas admits that. And I think it's on that level that those kinds of questions suddenly emerge. Like, wait, how do we calculate? What is the relationship of reciprocity? But the one claim that Levinas will never, ever let go of is that whole field of ethical and, I mean, at that point, political responsibilities is always founded on something that comes prior to it, which is an absolute relation. And he's worried that if you begin with something that's reciprocal or bilateral, then everything becomes subject to calculation. Ultimately, then, you end up with a kind of utilitarianism. Ultimately, then, nothing exists at the level of ethics except, okay, how do we get things, how do we distribute stuff? How do we distribute compassion or something like that? And Levinas thinks if we go that route, we're lost. And so he's saying the alternative is to begin with something that's absolute. But in a way, he pushes the problem back one degree, because the relationship between this face-to-face relation and the relation of justice or the third is never qualified, is never characterized. And you end up with two different relations that can't really be synthesized, and yet Levinas is saying this one depends on this one. And so, yeah, in a way, he just displaces that problem. But it is important that he holds to that as the key thing. Ethics would mean nothing if there weren't something unilateral. Actually, he has a great image in his Talmudic readings for this. It's from I don't know, Genesis or Exodus. I guess it's probably Exodus with the mountain. You know? Yeah, Exodus. Everyone knows the story at Sinai. God, gives the tablets of the law to the people of Israel, and the Hebrew word there is something like the people gathered under the mountain. This is usually understood. You gathered at the foot of the mountain, the bottom of the mountain. But there's this great kind of Talmudic reading of this where it's basically saying the people of Israel met literally underneath the mountain, and the rabbis interpret this. God basically picks up a mountain, holds it over the people of Israel, and then he says, "Hey, do you want to accept my covenant?" But that's a really clear picture, I think, of the deep unfairness of what Levinas means by ethics. it's not nice language of covenant. It's not, it's not this relational, like, I'm in a relationship to the other, and the other loves me. Levinas is saying that our ethical relationships are not something that we choose. They are thrust upon us, and we are subject to them. And this is what is both infuriating in Levinas, but also what you have to respect in him, because he's saying at a certain point that we have duties, we have responsibilities, and we can't question them. There's a certain point at which we can't kind of finesse them. There are just people suffering out there, and we have to go help them. And if we don't, then we're rotten. And if we don't, we've turned against what we need to do, without any kind of consolation. It's not, I do this and then everything works out, or I do this and then I'll be happy, or I'll do this and then they'll be happy. It's just, I just got to do it.
Does it speak at all to the consequence of not doing it? Or is that kind of just not?
Yeah, and that, I mean, he gets, he develops a certain notion coming out of Plato of the good beyond being, and he really wants to develop himself kind of in that line. And the way he ties himself to that tradition is to say, if the good is truly good, it has to be absolute. And so it can only be good if it doesn't, on the one hand, it forces us in the sense that we can't choose whether we have the responsibility or not. But if the responsibility and the response were both required, then we wouldn't be free. And he's not concerned with freedom in some sort of grounding sense, but in the sense of what would the good be. And he's saying goodness would only be goodness if it left open the radical possibility, basically, of being stepped on. If the good asserts its rights, then there's some way in which it's caught up with violence. And Levinas is saying if we want to have a kind of absolute good, then the good becomes radically subject to the violence of the world. And in that sense, he's saying that the ethical relation is only the ethical relation, is only the relation to the absolute other, to the extent that, of course, you can just turn away and ignore it. But even in ignoring it, it doesn't go away.
Could you place him a little bit for me? I mean, was he in reaction against trying to bring other thinkers to recognize ethical responsibility? I mean, did he trigger his people who followed his ethical paradigm? Or is he someone that is important for us to pay attention to, but not seen as powerful in terms of the flow?
So, sort of who has he influenced? But yeah, I mean, I think his thought has been very, very influential, largely in terms of opening up these problems that then people have had to look back and try to solve in one way or another. I mean, in particular, Jacques Derrida. Almost every word of Derrida is in dialogue in some sense with Levinas, and Derrida is worried especially about these problems of, on the one hand, he sees the logic of hospitality is nothing if it's not absolute, but then he's saying, but where does that leave us? Does that put us back in the sphere of theology in some sense? And so Derrida wants to have his Levinas and be a Greek too, and that's the big Levinas essay is this essay, Violence and Metaphysics, which is a really strange document because it's Derrida almost in a kind of violent way arguing that Levinas can't make the claims that he's making without invoking all of the tradition of ontology and being and violence that he wants to exclude. In a sense, it's Derrida forcing Levinas to remain a philosopher. If you want to be working on the sphere of reason and giving a kind of an account, then the only way I can interpret your account is as a violent kind of imposition. And in a sense, he's saying you can't escape the sphere of being, or you can't attain to the good beyond being without going outside of philosophy. So in Derrida, and everyone coming out of Derrida then is linked back to Levinas. And then he's been very, very influential outside of philosophy, especially in Christian theology. Jean-Luc Marion, in particular, sort of takes Levinas and, I don't know, the horrible way to say it, baptizes him, and gets and provides an account in which that radical relation to the other is one that is, in a sense, already reciprocal, maybe. So it's it maybe looks like something kind of Trinitarian. And so you still have this kind of absolute relation, but the absolute relation is to something that in principle can include the other, rather than always being absolutely other.
He's also in connection with
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the. I think Mark even quoted the oneself as another, which is in large part just a response to Levinas. And Ricoeur's sort of argument is everything that you're probably thinking, like, hey, can't we have a little reciprocity too? Or can't the self assert its rights? But then that's where Ricoeur is always in this position, kind of, in a sense, that stating the obvious, I feel, in that he sees what's wrong with Levinas, but I feel like he doesn't get the power there. Like, I think the thing that has to come through in Levinas is the sense that responsibility to the other, if it's something that we can kind of debate and hedge about, and we're really not doing it. And this is a problem, in any kind of school setting, when you talk about suffering. People, we have debates in whatever class, and there are people out there who are suffering, or we talk about the third world, and there's something very much in bad taste, I think, in the way that we do that. Because we're always, a priori, setting that up as something that we talk about. Hey, let's talk about the situation in the third world. When the situation in the third world really isn't something that we talk about, right? It's something we're already implicated in, to the point that, on some level, we should be doing nothing but just running out of the classroom and heading straight to somewhere, saving somebody. And so, and of course that's not the solution, right? It's not like we should actually do that. But what Levinas allows us to do is see why that problematic is so deeply embedded. It allows us to have a bad conscience, or it forces us to have a bad conscience about our ability to debate things that really are beyond debate.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you so much. I do have to end with one point, though. Okay, so now you've left me, with such a radical problem. I really feel the force of it now. And here's one way to express it. I've got a really good friend who, of course, in his youth was a Christian. And his belief or love of God was so impressed on him, but he hated God. And the only thing he could do was drink. It's the only thing that would help him negotiate his the force that God put on him to believe in him. And yeah, so he could just drink to figure this out. And in fact, now he's like a good drunk. It's fantastic. But he has to live this kind of life to forget about this other and what he owes this other. Now I'm absolutely terrified of what I do. I don't thank you. This is terrible. I'm totally bummed. But anyway, no, I do thank you. And he ends as far as a true philosophical discourse. But yes, what a wonderful problem. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for coming.